Welcome back to The Heat. Our special guest is journalist, author, and activist Chris Hedges. Let's get back to the interview. Chris, I want to talk about what has become known in the United States as the prison industrial complex. This country has the highest incarceration rate in the world, most of them black men. 2.2 million people are behind bars, although the actual figure, by some counts, is closer to 8 million when you count in people who are awaiting trial, others. Right. And there is even a figure of 20 million. Then, of course, we have police violence against black men, mainly. Rarely are they prosecuted. Why are things like this not major issues in an election campaign?
Because so many of those people have been disenfranchised. If you have a felony conviction, you can't vote. In states like Alabama, that's pushing 40% of black men. So they're locked out of the political system. Of course, if you are in prison, you can't vote. What we've seen in city after city in the United States is the guts, the physical guts of these entities have been ripped out with the flight of manufacturing, the loss of jobs. Unemployment is massive. Infrastructures are crumbling. Bridges, roads, highways, because they're not maintained. Our public transportation service, our train system is a wreck. I came into New York this morning. The subway from Penn Station to Uptown just had stopped running. I don't even know why. We all had to get out and walk. So what's happened is we have left, especially those who don't have advanced degrees, maybe high school education or less, unskilled workers, bereft of any way to make a living. And they're in essence redundant or surplus labor. They don't produce money for corporations on the streets of American cities, but locked in a cage, they can produce $40,000 or $50,000 a year for prison contractors, guards, correction guards, unions, phone companies, because everything's been privatized in the prisons. Global Tel-Link, which will charge rates 4 to 5 times higher than what people who are not in prison pay. The commissaries have all been privatized. We have 1 million prisoners in this country work for for-profit corporations, big ones, Hewlett-Packard and Starbucks, McDonald's, and it's a long list. So I think that this is a consequence of a distorted economy, and there are many, many entities. We haven't even talking about, food service, like Aramark, food service corporations that, because all the food service has been privatized, that can, in essence, make money off this captive population. And you take the private prison industry, Corrections Corp of America, they on their website say that they are a good investment because America has a 64% recidivism rate. There's no programs in most of these prisons. These people are not given vocational skills. They're not given the kind of counseling many of them need. They serve these incredibly draconian sentences, and then they are released onto the streets, many with warrants, because they're, if they have fines, parking fines, whatever it is, they accrue interest, child payments, and if they can't meet the payments, they go right back to prison. We had an incident a few months ago where a man was stopped for a burned-out taillight. He got out of the car and ran because he had warrants that he couldn't pay, which meant he would have gone right back into prison. He was shot in the back by the police and killed. As far as the police violence, that's not really new within African-American communities, as African-American activists and scholars such as James Cone and others will tell you. But now, because we have the capacity to capture that on video cameras, people are actually seeing what African-Americans, I think, have endured for some time. But it's 3.1 people a day are killed on the streets of American cities by law enforcement officials, and the vast majority of those are unarmed.
Right, looking at what kind of programs there are in prison for people who are incarcerated. We have a show later this week on The Heat. It's on the incarceration of women in the United States. We talked to some former prisoners who told us that their experience is that the emphasis when you're in prison is on punishment rather than rehabilitation. Right. And we know that there is a great deal of brutality in prisons. One just has to look at what's coming out of Rikers Island, very close to where you are in New York. We talked with a warden at one of the women's prisoners in women's prison in New York State, and this is what she told us. Let's listen.
We're spending 2, 3, 4 times as much to keep them in prison as we would to give them the best services on the outside. I think that's a little crazy. We incarcerate more people than any place else in the world. I mean, and we want to see ourselves as a civilized society. I don't think those two go together. We obviously have to backtrack.
And the point she made to us was that this is a system that is in serious need of reform. Do you see anything like reform coming along?
No. That's because the prison industrial complex and their lobbyists write the laws. You know, they are determined because they make money off of keeping these prisons full. 25% of the world's prison population. We are 5% of the world's population. Half of those people never committed a violent crime. They are in there for drug offenses. These 3 strikes you're out laws, which were passed during the Clinton era. That's what's so disturbing, that there are so many, and that just, I think, mirrors what's happening throughout the society. People, you know, across the political spectrum, there were not the support for the bailouts of Wall Street in 2008. Constituent calls were 100 to 1 against those bailouts, but they passed anyway. People do not want their privacy taken from them in the most sophisticated security and surveillance apparatus in human history. And I covered, as a reporter, the Stasi state in East Germany. People do not want to see habeas corpus taken from them. You know, the list goes on and on and on. But that is the kind of paralysis that's happened because government has been deformed to serve the interests of a tiny corporate oligarchic elite. People don't want these trade deals such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and yet all sorts of mechanisms are put into place to ram it down the throats of the American people anyway. And so the prison, you know, the inability to have a rational response to the penal system is just part of a much broader paralysis that has gripped the governing centers within the United States.
You know, as you say, most people do not want their privacy infringed. In fact, you write in your book, Wages of Rebellion, you say, no one lives under constant surveillance who is subject to detention anywhere at any time, whose conversations, proclivities, and habits are recorded, stored, and analyzed, can be described as free. You know, when you look at whistleblowers like NSA contractor Edward Snowden exposing what the U.S. government is doing, what its surveillance programs are all about, why is there no national outrage about these practices?
Part of it is the press. I mean, we have to remember that the press in the United States, again, this was under Clinton when he deregulated the FCC, was gobbled up by a handful of corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Clear Channel. So, you know, 90-some% of what Americans watch and listen to comes from these corporate entities. And these aren't like the old media conglomerates like Hearst newspapers or something. These are large global corporations where quote-unquote news is just one more revenue stream that has to compete with other revenue streams, which is why, of course, the media is giving so much time to Donald Trump. I think CNN revenues have rocketed up, you know, by over 150%. The same thing with Fox News, CBS. The head of CBS, the CEO of CBS, just made a statement saying Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's very good for CBS. So they've kind of walked away from journalism. Everything is judged on its ability to gather revenue and not to defy the kinds of corporate interests that provide that revenue. So there's been a real corrosion, especially in the electronic media. So the kinds of debates we should be having, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on penal reform, whether it's on the regulation of Wall Street, whether it is indiscriminate use of lethal force, especially against poor people of color, is just not happening.
You mentioned climate change. That's something that you feel very strongly about. You've written extensively about that. The climate scientist James Hansen said that if the XL Keystone pipeline, which is going to be running through a central part of America, if it is ever completed, it would be, quote, game over for climate. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, he also, after the meeting in Paris, you know, called the new climate agreement a fraud. It was actually a step backwards. Instead of, you know, raising or trying to meet a goal of capping limits at 2%, 2 degrees. We're now talking about 3.5 degrees. You know, we are watching, I mean, the kind of descent of political discourse now is almost unimaginable. Donald Trump tweets something about Megyn Kelly, the Fox News anchor in the Washington Post and the New York Times, rebroadcast or re-amplify this, this kind of inane bickering and the size of his hands. I mean, it's, I think for many of us who have been chronicling over the years the deterioration of the American system, even this is hard to fathom. So, climate change, of course, is something that we should be having a national discourse on. We don't have much time left. I mean, by 2020, if we don't stop all carbon, or 80% of carbon emissions, the Greenland ice sheets will be gone. We're talking about, the sort of flooding of all major coastal cities and some inland cities like London. I mean, and yet, we've kind of retreated into this P.T. Barnum-like circus or carnival, which has replaced politics, and everybody's complicit. It's not just Trump. The press is completely complicit in this.
Looking at your book, overall, it's a bleak picture of what the United States is right now and its political system and the practices that go on here. Are you hopeful about the future?
Well, what hope I have comes from people who will rise up and carry out acts of civil disobedience quite effectively, I should add, in cities like Chicago, where they have really been able to pressure the centers of power. We have anti-fracking activists, boycott, divestment, sanction activists against Israel. That's kind of all we have left. Certainly, I think that if we continue to trust in the elites will do what they have now been doing for several decades, which is serve the centers of corporate power at our expense and finally at the expense of the ecosystem on which we depend for life.